Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm joined by Sheldon Richmond, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. First thing, let me tell you all that we've got this fantastic one-day blockbuster conference that we're putting together. It's going to be on Saturday, October 18th. This has all the makings of the greatest conference that we've put on in our 25-year history at the Future of Freedom Foundation. The theme of the conference is Stop the Wars on Drugs and Terrorism, which we believe are the two forces that are most threatening to the lives and the peace and prosperity and freedom of the American people. And we've got an awesome lineup. It's going to be held at Columbia University. We're doing it in partnership with the Young Americans for Liberty, which, as you know, is one of the fantastic young people's libertarian organizations. And we've got Glenn Greenwald coming up from Brazil. He's, of course, the contact for Edward Snowden and the release of the NSA massive surveillance records that showed what they've been doing to us, the American people, as well as so many other people around the world. And in addition to Greenwald, we got a tremendous lineup of other people, and they're going to alternate between talks on the drug war and talks on the war on terrorism, the national security state. I may miss some of them, but we've got Eugene Jarecki, Hollywood producer, who's done two fantastic documentaries, one on the drug war and one called The House I Live In, and then another one on the national security state called Why We Fight. Jonathan Turley, who has spoken for us in the past. He's a George Washington University law professor who's done fantastic work on civil liberties and ranked one of the top 500 lawyers in the country. Matt Welch, editor of Reason Magazine. Radley Balco, who's really in the news these days with his book, The Rise of the Warrior Cop, which is, of course, pertinent in light of what's going on in Ferguson, Missouri. Hina Shamsi from the ACLU. And others whose name escapes me at the moment. So it's going to be a fantastic conference. We're going to have a panel after all the talks are done that consists of all the speakers. And I think this may be the most important conference we've ever put on because of the message, the urgency of what's going on with respect to these two wars. The admission price for the conference, again, it's going to be at Columbia University on October 18th. Admission price is free. That through the generosity of one of our donors, we're able to provide this conference. The donor who feels just as we do is that how important these two wars are. And he has said he's going to fund the expenses of this conference, and we're going to make admission free in order to provide the opportunity for as many people as possible, including students at Columbia University, to attend the conference. So we'll hope you join us. I think it's going to be I know it's going to be just a fantastic event. And so mark your calendar and hopefully come on over to New York City on that day, October 18th, and join us. Sheldon, I thought that today it would be appropriate to talk about labor, since yesterday was Labor Day. And sometimes people ask us, what is the libertarian position on labor, on unions, on strikes, and of course, minimum wage. I think everybody knows our position. And there was I noticed in the news, there was lots of articles talking about the minimum wage on Labor Day and how it needs to be raised. And one of the amusing aspects of it was that they're calling people who pay, who fail to pay overtime in terms of time and a half, they're calling it wage theft. That they're stealing wages, I guess, from employees. I mean, it's so ridiculous. But I thought, well, okay, on Labor Day, let's talk about what the libertarian position is on labor unions and strikes and labor regulations and minimum wage laws and so forth. What do you think?
Yeah, great subject. It's perennial. It's always something to talk about, and might as well tie it to the calendar with Labor Day, which, by the way, was signed into law nationally by Grover Cleveland, who's usually considered a laissez-faire president and is actually the favorite president of some libertarians I know, or at least the least bad president in the thinking of libertarians I know. So there's an interesting angle there, and I was going to say something about Cleveland as we go along because he said some interesting things at the height of the late 19th century pre-progressive era, he said some interesting things which are a little bit counterintuitive as far as libertarians are concerned. People, labor as organized has looked to the state for quite a while now for things like the minimum wage and union enforcement, union rules backed by the government and things of that nature. But I always like to look at I like to remind people of the greater context, which is provided really by our guys, naming the libertarians, Frederick Bastiat, Benjamin Tucker in the United States, that these things didn't arise in a vacuum, in a policy vacuum. In fact, rather they arose in a fairly corporatist context. In other words, workers were seeing the state used to provide privileges to manufacturers and railroad magnates, and so therefore thought, okay, this is how we do things. We go to the state. Let's go and get ours. Now, this was already described by Bastiat and he died in 1850. He said that as democracy spreads, as the franchise spreads, and more people get to vote and influence government, when they see one privileged group, they're going to say, well, it's about time that we got in on the privileges, almost like a playing field leveling operation. I think sometimes libertarians, certainly conservatives, and even so-called liberals and statist leftists look at this outside of its proper context. Namely, the government was already dispensing lots of privileges. The proper answer should have been, let's get rid of those privileges, let's end those privileges, rather than let's start extending privileges to the excluded groups. But you can see how that would arise. Most people would think, well, no, let's get ours, not let's undo privileges, but let's get in on the action. And I think that's what happened.
Yeah, first of all, on your Cleveland point, it's interesting you bring up Grover Cleveland. One of my favorite quotes is from that veto message. And I think Democrats are always embarrassed by Cleveland's veto message of a Texas Farm Bill, where he said, look, it is not the job of government to be supporting the citizens in this way. It was, of course, one of the earliest instances of where the federal government was going to give a grant to people suffering from a recession or depression. And he said, no, that's not the role of government in the United States. And I think that notion to people who have grown up under a welfare state is absolutely shocking. But on to the subject at hand. Yeah, I think people have lost sight of the fact, including labor, that the free market is the greatest friend of workers. A truly unhampered market economy, not the kind of regulated, controlled society we have today. I mean, we get accused sometimes of the left of defending our capitalist system. And you and I both know that this is not a capitalist system in the sense as you and I want a free market system. We want a system where there is a total separation of economy and the state, where the government has no authority whatsoever to regulate economic activity. And that'd be the greatest thing that could happen to workers. For one thing, the more businesses that are competing in a marketplace, the better off the workers are, because they're competing for workers. So if you've got 100 businesses that are out there prospering, providing goods and services to consumers, that's in the interest of people in their capacity as workers, as employees, because you got more people bidding for labor services as compared to, let's say, 2 or 3 businesses. So it's the interest of the workers to have more prospering businesses in the economy. And how do you get prospering businesses in the economy? Eliminate the income taxes, eliminate the regulations that serve as barriers to the entry of workers. So this thing's been ingrained in us that you need government to protect the workers. You need the government to protect them from subsistence wages that would be paid. I mean, this is all nonsense. If you look, for example, at the minimum wage, there's a lot of businesses that are paying more than the minimum wage. Why do they do that? Well, because market conditions sometimes force them to do that. That there's a lot of businesses competing for a limited supply of workers, and so they end up offering wages that are higher than what the government's mandating. At the same time, government is no friend of workers in many instances. Take, black teenagers. They have a chronic, permanent 40% unemployment rate. That's because of minimum wage laws. That's the only reason that they're out there with this chronic, permanent unemployment rate. Because in a truly unhampered free market, as you know, Sheldon, there would be no permanent chronic unemployment. There would be plenty of opportunities for everyone. So I think that's what we need to keep emphasizing, that these regulations, these controls are the worst thing that can happen to workers, and the free market is the best thing that could ever happen to people in their work capacity.
Yeah, getting back to Cleveland, of course, the workers in Cleveland's time, 1880s, let's say, were not operating in a free market. They were operating in a market that was heavily distorted as a result of the Civil War. War is the health of the state, let's remember, and civil wars are not excluded from that law. And government subsidies and tariffs and all kinds of grants, patents and copyrights and things of that nature. Cleveland, while he vetoed an ad hoc aid bill to Texas farmers, said in his 1888 State of the Union address, this was his last State of the Union address of his first term. You recall his two terms were split by Benjamin Harrison's victory in the Electoral College in 1888. But he said that looking around at the economic health of the country, he said, we discover that the fortunes realized by our manufacturers are no longer solely the reward of sturdy industry and enlightened foresight, but that they result from the discriminating favor of the government. And they are largely built upon the undue exactions from the masses of the people. The gulf between employers and the employed is constantly widening. And he goes on and on about this. This sounds like Robert Reich or maybe even Barack Obama. He's talking about a class analysis here about how employers and capital, because of their links to government, are exacting wealth from workers. And he even goes on to say that socialism, he called it communism, but he said socialism on behalf of workers is a response to what he called the socialism of combined, or the communism of combined wealth and capital, or what he also called the communism of pelf, in other words, of privilege, of wealth and privilege. He said that came first, and then the response, as Bastiat predicted, the response was workers saying, well, we should get a piece of this action too. If the state's giving out goodies, we should be getting some of the goodies. And so it arises in a context, as I said originally. They turn to the state. So we need to preach the message that turning to the state, first of all, as more and more people gain access to the state, you end up with Bastiat's conundrum, namely that everybody can't be living at the expense of everyone else. If everyone sticks his hand in the pocket of the next person, and that goes around the circle, that doesn't work out very well. That's not a way to produce wealth or raise living standards, which was Bastiat's answer to everybody getting in on the action. He said, no, you've got to shut down the action, shut down the privileged dispensing, and have the market that you're talking about, where there's a true free competition. And I would add to the list of things you talked about, besides the minimum wage and these other measures, zoning and licensing and permits, which exclude people from, mostly poor people, from getting into a growing list of occupations, and intellectual property, which keeps people from using ideas which are out there and are part of ideas are part of the commons, and the idea of enclosing them, I think, is a violation of people's rights.
Yeah, your point about licensure is absolutely right on in this subject area, because they sell licensing of occupations and professions as a protective device for the consumer. Oh, if the government wasn't licensing doctors and lawyers and shoe shine people and hairdressers, why there would just be this medical catastrophe or legal catastrophe or whatever. Well, that's just nonsense. Milton Friedman wrote that great essay on licensure of doctors. He took the toughest case. And because he figured, well, if you make the toughest case and show it's just a protection racket, everything else falls into place. The licensure laws for the hairdressers and the shoe shine people and so forth. And this is just a protection device. It's a racket to protect those that have the licenses. It's like a little cartel, or like the guilds in the Middle Ages, that if you're not a member of the guild, then you can't practice that profession. It's just an updated version of that concept. And it hurts people, the poor, as you point out, who can't afford the huge expenses that you have to go through the educational courses and pass all the highfalutin tests to get your license. So it's really a protection racket. I saw it particularly in the law business which I was a lawyer for 12 years or so, and they said, licensure laws are designed to protect the people against unscrupulous or incompetent lawyers, which is ludicrous because there's plenty of unscrupulous, incompetent lawyers out there that have licenses. And it's actually even worse because they induce people into thinking that because the state's given them a license, that must mean they're good lawyers, competent lawyers, honest lawyers, and nothing could be further from the truth. So, these rackets exist under the guise of, we're here to help the worker and so forth, help the consumer, when really it's just a racket that ends up hurting the people at the bottom of the economic ladder. I thought I'd also mention the concept of unions. Libertarians have nothing against unions per se. That in a free market, you would have workers combining in associations or unions, if you want to call them. And that's part of what a free market's all about. But it would all be negotiated with respect to the businesses where they're associating. A business certainly would have the right to say, in this business, I'm not going to permit a union. And then workers could say, well, I don't want to work for you. And so if you have a multiplicity of businesses competing, well, workers can say, we'll go elsewhere, thank you very much, which might then induce the businessman to say, okay, never mind. If he wants good workers, then they say, okay, then go ahead and form a union, which very well may be beneficial in terms of lobbying for better working hours or better working conditions and so forth. So there's nothing inherent in a free market economy that says there will be unions in every business, or there won't be. It's all a matter of negotiation and working out the terms under conditions that exist on supply and demand in that business. Same thing with the wage rates, that the market determines these. And the market, of course, is based on where consumers are putting their money. The businesses that are prospering are the ones that are going to be able to offer higher wages and attract workers over. And so, again, I emphasize the free market is the best friend of every worker. Not only for his particular business does he have a vested interest in his business doing well, because that enables his wage rates to go up if the business is doing well, but it's his interest that other businesses are doing well and that there's a lot of new businesses coming into existence that are doing well as well.
No, agreed. When compulsory unionism came in and during the New Deal under the Wagner Act, creating the National Labor Relations Board, I think it's instructive to keep in mind that the most radical of unions, the industrial workers of the world, the IWW or the Wobblies, opposed it. They saw that it was a trick. It was a way to domesticate labor by bringing their leaders, the leaders at least the government was willing to recognize or the corporations were willing to recognize, as junior partners in the corporate state. Let them sit around. We know the New Deal was really a reinforcement of the corporate state. Bring these so-called respectable leaders to the table, a junior position, of course, but nevertheless let them sit at the table, set up rules, and then let's have the unions enforce the contracts on their members rather than the corporate officers enforcing it. It was a very ingenious plan to domesticate and co-opt real worker movements, and the police opposed it. They never joined that regime. I mean, I see unions in a free market as merely an extension of the mutual aid principle, which libertarians like. It's a form of mutual aid. It's a form of looking out for your like-minded people who are maybe in the same profession as you, same job. The biggest transgression that Cleveland had in mind was the tariff. The tariff, of course, there was an expression in those days, the tariff is the mother of the trusts. The tariff was the growth of monopolies and these large combinations, which a lot of people like Benjamin Tucker saw as unnatural, not as natural outgrowths of the market, were attributed to the tariff, which prevented outside competition, external foreign competition from competing with these privileged companies. So that was the big one he had in mind, but there are other things too. Licensing is beginning to come along, professional associations, and things of that nature. I agree with you that the truly free market is the friend of workers. But if we're going to be persuasive about that, I think we need to be much more nuanced than how we describe the late 19th century. Because if we try to persuade advocates of labor, good faith advocates of workers and labor, that the 19th century was an example of what we mean by free markets, we will lose the debate. because they'll come back with Cleveland statements saying, how do you explain Cleveland? He's no radical. He's no leftist. He's no communist. Why is he talking about class conflict and capital exacting wealth from workers? We have to say, yeah, and they used the state to do that. So in other words, that wasn't laissez-faire. We got to be very clear about that, or else we'll lose this debate in trying to convince people that laissez-faire, truly radically freed markets are the friend of workers.
Yeah, I'd be the first one to condemn the corporatism of the late 19th century, the government business partnerships, the government getting into bed with big corporations, the corporate grants, and so forth. But at the same time, I think we need to always continue to emphasize the positive part of the 19th century. No Social Security. I mean, this is a shocking notion that the American people lived without Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, public schooling by and large, welfare, and the drug war. And I think it's important to draw that distinction of how different Americans were in that sense from today's Americans, and that's a positive. So that when we construct this ideal of a free society, we can point to when people say, oh, that's impossible, we could never live without these welfare state programs, we can turn around and say, what do you mean impossible? Here is a society where people lived without these things. Now, how do we build on that? Well, we ditch them because they clearly showed you could live without these. But then you also ditch what you've been talking about is the corporatism that was inherent to the 19th century, the government business partnerships, people getting in bed with each other on the business and government end and so forth. It is an interesting period, that late 19th century, because of what the progressives were able to accomplish. I mean, if you look at their position, despite the fact that you had this corporatism, it would seem to me that they're in much the same position that you and I are in as libertarians. I mean, our job looks daunting. You know, how can we convince Americans to abandon their commitment to a welfare state, to a regulated economy, to a planned economy? And that's a daunting task, but their task was daunting as well, as how do we convince people to adopt a welfare state and a warfare state too? You know, one that goes abroad in World War I and World War II and then the national security apparatus. But yet they did it. I mean, the progressives did, in my opinion, bring about a revolution in terms of the role of the federal government in American society. It was the welfare warfare state revolution that was mounted on top of this corporatism that you and I both agree was a bad thing. But if they could do it through the power of ideas and the power of persuasion, it seems to me that we can do it too, the other way around. That we can show people that libertarianism is the friend of the working man, especially the man at the bottom of the economic ladder, that the leftists their policies are condemn the poor to a life of poverty. We see that with the black teenagers. It locks them, minimum wage locks them out of the labor market, and then they don't get that on that bottom rung of the economic ladder. They don't learn work skills. They don't learn how to start a business, how to run a business, and then they're consigned to a life of welfare, or even worse, they go into the drug trade because the drug war induces them with these exorbitant black market profits, and a lot of them end up spending their lives in the penitentiary. So yeah, I say separate economy and the state, but at the same time, build on what our ancestors believed in, repeal the welfare warfare state.
I'd add to that. It's true that the late 19th century we did not have Social Security, although we had the seeds of it in the Union Army pension plan, which was being widely expanded by Congress, and they were getting a taste of what it was like to hand out pensions. But we didn't have Social Security in general, Medicare, the things named. We had Cleveland let an income tax become law. It got stricken not because the income tax is unconstitutional, but property income tax was stricken as unconstitutional. But I would say this: the crises sown by corporatism, and I mean by crises, I mean bank panics, depressions, inflations, made the programs that didn't exist in the late 19th century palatable to the American people. So when the Great Depression came along in 1929, they were more open to such things. But those crises, like the Great Depression, grew out of corporatism. So you could say the corporatism plants the seeds, because it will create economic instability. It plants the seeds for the welfare state. As Robert Higgs points out in his book, Crisis and Leviathan, when you have a crisis, people are more willing to look to the government to help them out in a crisis. Whether they think it's temporary or not, they still need help. They're not economists. They don't understand how the crisis came along. They don't understand how to end the crisis. So they look to government. They're more open to a politician's message for new programs. So I would say that the late 19th century sowed the seeds of the very things that we are today calling for the repeal of.
Yeah, I also point out that you mentioned an income tax, but that for most of the American history, from the time the Constitution called the federal government into existence through 1913, there was no income tax. People lived income tax free, which again shows that you can have a society that's free of this type of taxation that to me is one of the greatest destructions of wealth and prosperity for the working man, because he can't accumulate the necessary nest egg to compete against the well-established businesses, because the more he makes, the more they take. While in the 19th century, you had businesses popping up and starting right and left because people were free to keep everything they earned. People were going from rags to riches. The poor were going from rags to riches in 1, 2, or 3 generations through the process of unhampered market activity, keeping everything you earn, no licensing laws. I mean, that's what free enterprise meant. Enterprise that is free of government control. And then you had no Federal Reserve either. You had no fiat money, government paper money. You had gold and silver coins, which were the money that gave people a sense of monetary stability, of predictability in their financial affairs. I mean, you and I would say there should be a denationalization of money, a separation of money in the state. But certainly the second best is, instead of irredeemable paper money, which is, of course, the engine of inflation, provides the engine of inflation for the Fed, they didn't have a Fed or paper money. There's also, you mentioned tariffs and so forth. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the issue of immigration. I mean, people believed in open immigration during this period of time. Except for a cursory tuberculosis inspection at Ellis Island, anyone was free to come to the United States. And today people would say, oh, that's hurting the worker. Nonsense. It was one of the reasons why there was this tremendous burst of economic prosperity in the United States throughout the 19th century, because immigrants bring in this vitality and energy that sometimes the citizens living in that place don't have. They vitalize a society, and we've seen this time and time again. So that not only should we get rid of these tariffs, which, as you say, induce these little privileged positions for American businesses, it protects them from overseas competition. By the same token, open the borders to the free movements of not only goods, but people as well.
Yeah, and let's flesh that out a little bit more. It doesn't just protect the American companies from competition. It keeps prices up. So that hurts workers and consumers, people who might be able to scrape together money and start their own business or start a worker co-op or something like that, where they can be free of having to work for somebody else. I mean, there's a lot of sentiment expressed in the early industrial revolution by industry owners of factories who said things like, if they work for themselves, they won't work for us. And this is one reason why you get things like settlement laws. Adam Smith complained about them, where workers couldn't move from town to town or district to district to find the best work. They couldn't. It was like an internal passport system, or the Combination Act, which kept workers from getting together to improve their lot. So there was this real concern that if people could work for themselves, they won't go to work for us, or they'll ask too much money. So we have to sweep away all the barriers to self-employment, small-scale employment, worker management, all those things, which I know often sound left-wing, but those are right out of the libertarian tradition. If you read the early American libertarians, I'm talking about Neil Tucker, Spooner, those people, this is the kind of talk you hear. They were concerned about workers. They figured the employers could take care of themselves. They had access to political power already. It was unorganized workers who were paying the price for this system.
Well, I recall the the Cobden and Bright free trade movement in Great Britain, where the common man, the regular people, were supporting the free trade movement in Cobden and Bright. And I remember there's a picture of a cannon where the common people were protesting against the protectionist barriers that England had. And on the cannon it says free trade or this. So they were saying, hey, you give us free trade or you get the cannon shot here. And because people were recognizing, ordinary people, the working man was recognizing that the libertarians at that time, Richard Cobden and John Bright, were right. Bastiat was doing his work in France at the same time in favor of free trade. And that's what we're fighting for. I mean, we're fighting for a free society, which encompasses a free market society that is free movements of goods and services, get rid of all the tariffs and protectionist barriers and regulations, free movements of people, unhampered markets within the United States, total free enterprise, get rid of the corporatism, the socialism, the interventionism, the regulation. Then you've got the makings of, and then of course the warfare state, get rid of that too, all that national security apparatus. Now you're talking about a genuinely free society all of a sudden, and so we're raising people's vision to a higher level with what we do. In any event, as I start out the show, we've got this great conference. Go to our website. We've got a registration page there. It's going to be on October 18th at Columbia University in New York City. The title is Stop the Wars on Drugs and Terrorism. Got a great lineup. I think I failed to mention Jeremy Scale, who's spoken for us in the past. His great book is Dirty Wars. His documentary of the same name, Dirty Wars, got nominated for an Oscar for best documentary last year. So he's going to be one of the speakers. I think I may have missed somebody. We'll catch up next week. Love to have you join us. It's going to be fantastic. Anyway, that's the show. This is the Libertarian Angle with Sheldon Richman and me, Jacob Hornberger, and we'll see you next time.